How do we respond to all of the tragedy and the disaster and the distress and the grief that comes? It really depends upon who we believe God is. Not our theoretical idea, but who in our heart of hearts, our personal theology. Who is this God? Is he? Does he exist? Is he relevant and involved in the world today? In philosophy, they call that theodicy, trying to justify the ways of God. And it goes back to the book of Job. You recall that story. There was a little disaster in his life, his whole family and all his property taken away. And Satan had a grip on him that God allowed for a time. And though not all of Job's responses were entirely as he might have wanted them to have been, looking back on it, he still steadfastly continued to believe in the same God. And to the point where he said, though he slay me, yet will I serve him. We can be confused, we can insist on answers, we can be angry when the answers don't come. We can respond to tragedies those ways, and many people do. Many people turn their backs on God when things happen that negatively impact their lives, and they don't want anything to do with God again. They become embittered, and that's just the way it's going to be. And you probably know people like that, and I do too, and it's so sad. It is so sad, because God still loves them tremendously. And they're missing something. No matter how bad the tragedy is, they're missing something. What they're missing is the fact that God wants to use every negative experience in our lives for our good. He doesn't want us to respond by retreating and withdrawing and isolating ourselves from him. We can discern God's purposes if our hearts are open, if we remain steadfast in our belief in God. God's purposes always involve his great eternal purposes and plan, and we don't know what that's all about. It's unfolding through the ages. It was articulated back in the Garden of Eden and repeated throughout the events of history, and especially emphasized to the Jewish people in exile in Jeremiah 29. I know the plans I have for you, plans not to hurt you, but plans to give you hope in a future, plans to bless you. This is God's heart. And no matter what we go through, that's his basic attitude that underscores all of the rest of his purposes. Well, I wanted to go through all of John chapter 11 this morning. That's all my introduction. And I don't know we're going to get through all of John 11. But you know the story perhaps, and if you don't, let me tell it to you in little sound bites. And the big question we're dealing with responds to the statement, times of distress and grief give God an opportunity to deepen our spirituality. And then we ask how? How can God use times of distress and grief to deepen our spirituality? That's part of his great plan. And three things I want to suggest quickly and pull them together out of the story of Lazarus' life and death and life. How does God plan to deepen our spirituality through these times of distress? By challenging our worldview, by walking with us through the pain, and by building our hope and confidence in him. You probably know the story. Jesus had three great friends and lived in Bethany, just a few miles from Jerusalem. He probably stayed there with Lazarus and his two sisters, Mary and Martha, from time to time. And he was up in Galilee, and the Jews had already begun threatening his life. And he got news that Lazarus, his good friend, was sick. He decided not to go there. Wow, that's strange. He had healed so many people that theoretically he didn't even know. But here's one of his good friends, and he didn't go to visit him in his moment of sickness. And then he tells the disciples later on, I didn't go for two reasons. One, there's something more important than my going there to visit him in his sickness right now. It's a calculated act of holding back. And it was because he wanted Lazarus to die. And Lazarus did die. What? And as Mary later on said, Lord, if you had been here, you could have prevented this tragedy. It's okay. I wanted him to die. I want him to die because I want you to see the glorious power of God. And sometimes, folks, when God allows things to happen that we see to be so negative and so hurting, he wants us to see the glorious power of God, but we will not see that if we are not with him. He had to take them with him for them to see what he was going to do to demonstrate the glorious power of God. And secondly, he says to them in verse 15 that he allowed Lazarus to die, he says, for your sake to the disciples, so that you might believe. When huge events happen in history, and such events that they cause people to start thinking about God, whatever they believe God to be, they are always there for us to make a decision about our view of God, either to disbelieve or to believe. And so that was what Jesus told the disciples. Well, how did he want to teach them through this time of grief and distress? First, by challenging their worldview. You see, Jesus was all about discipling people. Let me say something here that's not always comfortable in an evangelical congregation. Jesus didn't come simply to get people saved. He didn't come as an evangelist. And if you're quite content with just being saved, then shame on you, you're selfish. Because he didn't come just to get your name on the Lamb's Book of Life. If that were the case, he would have raptured you as soon as you said yes to Jesus. If his only concern was to get you to heaven, you'd be there by now. But he's got other purposes for you. Jesus came not as an evangelist, but as a disciple maker, to help people enter into an understanding of reality, to get their minds rewired, to perceive reality from God's point of view. That's the big task. Now, that starts with getting saved. I don't think anybody can ever come to a right worldview or an understanding of reality from God's point of view until they first humble themselves, admit they're a sinner, confess their sins, ask Jesus for the salvation that only he can give, and become born again. That's the beginning point. But that's not the end point. But many people kind of just stop right there. Okay, I got my names on the Lamb's Book of Life. I got my eternal life insurance policy, and I'm okay. No, you're not okay. Unless you're continuing to follow in the ways of God and be an obedient Christian. That's why I honor these 8 who are going to be baptized later today. This is a step of obedience. Does it make any sense just going down into the water and getting wet? Is that going to change you by itself? No, it's just going to get you wet. But it's a step of obedience. You're making a statement to the world through the church who will witness that I am separating myself from the old life, from the world, and I'm being raised into newness of life in Christ. That's an act of obedience that believers should take. It wasn't ever given as an option, in all honesty. It really is a command. So Jesus is out to change our view of reality, to help us understand life from God's point of view. Now, one of the big stumbling blocks in people's worldview and understanding of reality is, well, what do we do with this thing of death? I mean, death is the big enemy. And a lot of the tragedy of life focuses on death and dying. Individual family members that we love and who have cared for us or we care for, and they die, and God allows it to happen. And where is he in the midst of it all? Why does he let this happen to me? I've heard people say that. Somebody else dies, and why did God do that to me? Understandable in the midst of great pain. I'm not putting down the question. We do absorb pain personally, first of all. But death seemed to be so ultimate. Yes, I think the disciples probably had a pretty informed theology. They believed the Old Testament teachings and all the miracles, the Red Sea, the falling of the walls of Jericho, the raising of the Shunammite son by Elisha, the survival of Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego in the fiery furnace, and all of these parts of Jewish history where God showed himself to be powerful. I think they believed in all of that. And they saw Jesus do dozens of miracles way outside the bounds of the natural order. And yet here's this thing called death staring them in the face. Their own death, deaths of other people. Well, Jesus had more or less ministries of, you might say, resuscitation, as it might have been perceived to be, although I don't know if there's a Greek word for that or not. But they had seen Jesus work mightily in children especially. But here's one of his friends, an older man who has died. And Jesus doesn't go there until 4 days after he's been buried. What does Jesus want to show in that moment? He wants to show that the greatest and final enemy has no hold or power over God's purposes. It's a powerful idea, folks. Death does not trump the will of God. Death might be the final enemy, but it's a defeated enemy. And Jesus demonstrated that in the life of Lazarus. Now, did he intend for Lazarus to live, to be immortal from that point of view, life on earth forever? No. I'm sure Lazarus died. But Jesus wanted to give a living illustration of the death of death. John Owen, one of the old Puritan mystics and thinkers, wrote a book called The Death of Death and the Death of Christ. And that's the idea here that Jesus is showing. And you can walk through the story, you can see his ministry to Martha, first of all, how she wanted to believe and be faithful, but she was upset that Jesus didn't get there. And Jesus declares to her, Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. Now, let's try to time warp back to the first century into a Jewish culture. You're the what? What was that word you used? I'm the resurrection. Wait a minute, we don't have any examples of that. What are we talking about here? The Greek word for resurrection that we focus on a lot at Easter is anastasis. I'm the one who causes things to stand up that were dead. Resurrection means to take a stand up and to overcome, to overwhelm what was a defeat. I am that and the life. That's the lesson I want you to learn. That's how I want to rewire your thinking. So Martha and other mourners and disciples understand that God is way beyond your little theological box or your cosmological box or what you want to believe about reality, that what you think is the final answer, which is not an answer, it's a problem called death, it isn't so. And I'm going to show you. The main truth about gaining a biblical worldview is to realize that nothing can contain, explain, limit, frustrate, thwart, or subvert the love of God. Nothing, including death. And so the question of theodicy about if God is all-powerful, then he must not be all-loving because he lets things happen like this and he doesn't have a good will disposed toward us. Or if he's all-loving, he must not be all-powerful because while he might want to do what's good, he doesn't have the ability to do what's good. That's not a proper question. It's trying to reduce God to our simplistic formulas of how we think God should act. God achieves the fullness of his plan by bringing together all of his power and all of his love to complete what he decided he was going to do in providing a way for those of us who are sacred, people in whom is the image of God, providing a way for us to achieve our eternal destiny as sons and daughters of God, where physical death isn't going to in any way thwart God's intention. Second thing, during times of distress and grief, God has an opportunity to deepen our spiritual maturity by helping us see him experiencing the pain with us. God isn't some remote, distant being out there, unaffected by our struggles, our pain, what we're going through. The Greeks and Romans had a hard time with that because, you see, their view of God partly was that God was not able to be impacted by emotion or feelings. And God came to earth in Jesus Christ to show that is not a right view of God. He's a father. What father can see his children suffer and not feel pain with it? He was the first one. How do you think the fatherly heart of God felt at Calvary? And so anything that you've gone through and I've gone through that has brought grief and distress into our lives, God has gone through it with us. And he hurts with us and for us. And so Jesus goes to the gravesite knowing full well what he was going to do, that he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead. And still it says in the verse that's the shortest one in the Bible and maybe the most profound, Jesus wept. He wept with the grieving family. He knew what he was going to do, but his heart was broken. His heart was broken about what death and the concept of death does to humanity. And so Jesus wants us to understand that he walks through it all with us. Now we can ignore him, and many people do. Ignore him in the midst of distress and trial and blame him. But that's missing it. That's a wrong view of what's happening. He wants us to know he's walking through it all with us. Jesus wept. He shared their sorrow. He feels their pain. And he weeps with us in our losses. Now, in times of grief and disappointment and anger, those are natural parts of our grief cycle. I don't want to diminish the importance of the grief cycle that I think does happen when we have loss. But when we connect intimately with God, we sense his compassion, we sense his comfort, we sense his presence. And even though we still may not understand, and we still may not be able to accept it all, we still, in that moment of recognition of his presence, we're comforted. And we know that all things work together for good. That doesn't say all things are good. All things work together for good to those who love God and are called according to his purposes, Romans 8:28. It should not just be a wall plaque. It should be inscribed in our heart that God takes our bad stuff and he turns it into good for his purposes, for those who are walking with him, called according to his purpose. Because he walks through all of these times with us. The third way that God uses times of distress and discomfort and grief in our life is to give us an opportunity to deepen our spiritual maturity by building our hope and confidence in him. Because you see, Jesus does more than weep at the grave. He asks to be taken to the tomb, and he tells them, take away the stone. Take away the stone. And I guess I want to ask each of us, what is the stone in our life that's stopping God from having the freedom to show the power and glory that he has for us? I'm not saying he's going to raise somebody from the dead that you're grieving over, but for many of us, there's a stone that just blocks our soul. We're not willing for Jesus to tamper with our pain. Some people even begin to enjoy the pain, enjoy the idea that others are continuing to feel pity and remorse for them. Well, it's great to have people who are sympathetic and compassionate, but at some point or another, you need to be not the victim, but the victor. And help others in their moments, comfort others with the comfort that you've been comforted with, as Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians. And so Jesus says, roll away the stone. Roll away the stone. But Lord, the King James says, he stinketh. Lord, you don't want us to do that. It's gross, it's corrupt. You don't want to see into my pain. Jesus said, take it away. Stone is rolled away from the door, and Jesus cries out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out! And Lazarus walks out of the tomb, still wrapped in grave clothes, and Jesus says, unbind him. We could go another direction with that one too. Unbind him. Imagine that. And they do. It doesn't tell us what Lazarus did at that point. But the playwright Eugene O'Neill wrote a play back in 1925 called Lazarus Laughed. And he muses back upon this episode. And I'm not sure what the intent of his play was. I don't think he was particularly a man of devout Christian faith or worldview, but he talks about a scene occurring some years later between Lazarus and Caligula. Caligula was the Roman emperor from 37 to 41 AD. But Lazarus has been known as somebody who incessantly laughs. He laughs. He's out of control at times. He laughs at inappropriate moments. His laughter just fills the rooms where he is. He's laughing. He's laughing Lazarus. And Caligula, who's persecuting the church, one of the earlier persecutions of the church, has him before him. And he's trying to do all kinds of things to taunt Lazarus, to stop him from laughing. It's almost like the book of Job. He takes away his family. He sees his wife killed and everything. And Lazarus is still laughing. You think, how could you do that? And so here's this little dialogue where Lazarus explains the situation to Caligula. And he says, "Death is dead, Caligula. Death is dead. There is only the present and the future, and death is the fear in between." Now, it's not particularly a profound theological statement, other than death is dead. And Lazarus laughed, having seen the other side, realizing that death isn't the power that people think it is. Tragedy isn't. It doesn't have to have a grip on us. Tragedies in the past. Tragedies yet to come. People are fearing what's going to happen today. There's some threat about some kind of a car bomb going to happen somewhere. You know what? A Christian can walk right into the midst of a situation like that with confidence that doesn't matter what happens, God is still more powerful. He's behind it all. His purposes will be achieved. If they're negative upon me, let me find out what He's trying to do to deepen my spiritual maturity, because that's part of His purpose. So we get together every Sunday morning, and whether you're really into it or not, I hope you are, we're celebrating the power of God over death. Christians meet on Sunday. Jewish people didn't meet on Sunday, they met on Saturday. Why do Christians meet on Sunday? It's one of the strongest historical arguments for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Why would this group of Jewish people, as they were back then, all of a sudden start getting together and meeting on Sunday mornings to celebrate the resurrection? The power of God over every bit of death and defeat, destruction, disaster, and distress in our lives. That's why we get together on Sunday morning, to give praise to the wonderful God who stands behind it all. Well, I'm sure you still have a lot of challenges and questions in your life. Our screens are still wide open about what to do with the things that have been going on around and about us. But I hope you see that the program, I'm talking to you people who are technologically savvy here, the program behind the open screens is all of God. It's about God. He is the one who's achieving His purposes through it all for His glory.